Morning, everybody. Absolute pleasure, as Scott said. It's not the first time I've been here. In fact, it's the third time I've been here to talk at Sustainability Live, and I love coming back, meeting like-minded people, having great discussions, and learning myself as well while I'm here. So, I'm Steve Smith. I'm responsible for communications and thought leadership around energy management at Schneider Electric. And today, yes, I want to get straight to it because we don't have long. I want to talk to you about our vision for the fastest path to net zero. And I felt this is something hopefully useful to kick off this two-day event with, a kind of stock take on where are we, what do we need to be doing, where do we need to accelerate. So, without further ado, let's start out by where are we? Well, we are at the moment at an inflection point between a short-term energy crisis and a long-term climate crisis. And the energy crisis, for those of us based in Europe, we may feel that it's gone away. We don't have an energy crisis, but of course we've gone through a summer with not really much need for gas, but winter is coming and we still don't have replacement supplies. So we can anticipate that we are still in the midst of an energy crisis and a shortfall of energy that's required. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is a problem and how shifting to cleaner technologies actually mitigates the risk of energy crises in future. And then of course the long-term climate crisis. Last year when I was here, I stood up and talked about things that happened in the world that year. Clearly, I don't need to do that. It's getting worse and worse and worse every year, everything that we see. I mean, walking here today, beautiful day, unusually for September in London to be walking on a 32 degrees day, but it's a sign of the times that our weather is just changing faster than ever. So, with those two things, let's think about the climate crisis. How do we tackle this? Well, predominantly it's about needing to decarbonize, and what you see on screen here is the evolution of carbon emissions over the last 150 years or so. And you can see we started to get exponential growth around about the 1850s, late 1800s, to a point today where carbon in the atmosphere is higher than it's been on Earth for about 2 million years. And left unabated, we know we would be on a pathway to something like 4 to 6 degrees change in climate by the end of the century. Now, fortunately, that's not where we're actually at today. And we're more like 2.5 degree pathway with current commitments. So we are making progress, but we need to go much, much faster than that. So if we need to be on the target for 1.5 by the end of the century, we need to be net zero by 2050, we need to be halving emissions by the end of this decade. Where are we for that? Not enough. We are looking at saving something like 4 gigatons of carbon by the end of this decade, when we need to be saving 10 to 15. So we need to be going 3 times faster than we are today. But I don't know if anyone else in the room feels like there's been a wake-up call. It feels like there's more traction now, more starting to happen, or at least more acknowledgement of this. So the climate crisis, in tandem with the energy crisis, where we've seen gas prices from March 2021 to September last year rise by a fold of almost 25 times. So we're dealing with climate crisis and an energy crisis at the same time. And it means that really we are now at a critical juncture between these long-term targets and the short-term priorities that we need to deal with for the energy crisis. So I put up that slide about both of them, and actually the solution for both of those is energy. And in fact, in Schneider, what you see on the screen there at the Back to 2050 is a report that we did that shows how we can completely decarbonize energy by 2050. But we need to think about energy differently. We need to look at it differently to the way we do today. And that's because today, if we say, how do we decarbonize energy? Most people would probably say, this part, we need to replace it. We need to get rid of fossil fuels, and we need to transition to clean energy. And of course, that is the fundamental thing that we need to do. But in terms of getting to net zero energy by 2050, it's only half of the solution. And why is that? Because we tend to focus on the supply side of either purchasing renewables or generating renewables. But supply always chases demand. So we need to look at the flip side of the coin. We need to look at energy demand and how we tackle that. First of all, by electrifying. So it's great that we want to create more renewable energy. But as long as we still have things that require fossil fuels to run, we're still creating a demand for fossil fuels. So we need to electrify everywhere we can, from transport to the way we heat our homes to industries, everything that runs on fossil fuel today that can be transitioned to electricity as a vector for decarbonisation. Yes, today electricity comes partly from fossil, partly from renewables, partly from nuclear. There's a mix, but it is a vector to decarbonise energy completely. So we need to have more things that can run on that vector. And then lastly, reduce. This is about a quarter of the solution, but this is the priority right now. And all of those things, I'm going to talk about those three levers. Electrify, reduce, replace are the three levers to decarbonize energy. If you think about the supply side, it takes time for us to transition to all renewable energy. If you think about the switching to electrification, it will take time to move away from fossil vehicles and heating to electric solutions. But what we can do right now is reduce. We can use now as the time, and the energy crisis is the wake-up call for it. How do we use less energy, or how do we use energy more efficiently? And it's not rocket science, because today 60% of energy that's created is either lost or wasted. So we need to find ways that we can be more efficient with the way that we use energy. The solution we talk about, so third time back here, if any of you have been before, you'll have heard me talk about Electricity 4.0. This is our vision really for how we get to those goals, and it's a combination of two things, electric and digital. So digital because it allows us to make the invisible visible. How do we see our energy? How do we see our carbon emissions? We need to see it to be able to take action on it. And it allows us to deploy that energy more efficiently through automation instead of manual usage. And secondly, electric, because like I said, electric is the vector for decarbonisation over time of our energy sources. We put those together, it gives us sustainable, green and smart energy. And it's already starting to happen around us. The energy grid and the way we use energy is changing faster than any time in history. Let's look at this. So here's a typical model of how we used to create and consume electricity. And it was linear. We would go from creating electricity from fossil fuels to distributing them over big distances to points of consumption that just used that electricity, because in many parts of the world it was widely available and it was a relatively cheap commodity until recently with the crisis. It's changing because we're introducing renewables on the supply side. So at that point, it's still linear. We're making clean energy and we're distributing clean energy. But the big change really becomes the fact that it's no longer linear. It's bidirectional. So in the grid now, you have traditional supply, energy being created and distributed, but you're also creating it on the demand side. Solar panels on our roofs, wind turbines, microgrids that we have for businesses. And all of these help the climate crisis, but also the energy crisis, because you become energy sufficient, self-sufficient, energy autonomous. You don't need to buy energy from countries that happen to have fossil fuel in the ground, because we can make our own, whether that's a government level or a business level, or even homeowners putting solar panels on our roofs. So we transition to cleaner energy and we own it. Now I mentioned electric and digital. Electric is important because it reduces that dependency on fossil fuels. But what that will do is increase the pressure on the grid, which we're trying to make cleaner and introduce more renewables. And that's why electric goes hand in hand with digital. Because whilst we electrify, we should also be digitizing to deploy that energy more efficiently, meaning we use less of it. So as energy is now a much more costly commodity than before, we save money, but of course we also save carbon as we're transitioning as well. And as we do that, we're of course thinking about circularity for sustainability in everything we do, from design to build to operate to maintain, no longer just about create, use, recycle. It's about create, use, reuse, 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 recycle. In everything that we do, looking to make sure from raw materials, making sure that we avoid waste, through to recycling, upcycling, and predictive maintenance, which extends the life of things, meaning we can keep things for much longer. We don't need as many new things all the time. So we've gone through quite a few challenging times in the last couple of years. Firstly, with the global pandemic, but these challenging times often can be presented as catalysts for change. So you think about the global pandemic, that accelerated digital massively, from the way we do our shopping, the way we live our lives, the way we consume our entertainment, the way we work. I remember having Teams meetings for the first time a couple of years ago, and it was silent, and then everybody talks at the same time, and it was all awkward. Now it's completely a normal part of our lives to be far more digital than we were before. And it's about 4 or 5 year acceleration of digital that was caused by COVID. So now that we are in the midst of an energy crisis, this should be the wake-up point for accelerating both electric and digital. Electric, like I said, because we no longer need to rely on fossil fuels. We can create our own energy, and we can create energy in a way that is clean, and better for us, and more sustainable for our future. So the time for us to act is now. We all know this. I want to just take a step back for a minute and say I've talked a lot about energy and why energy is so significant for decarbonisation. Let's go back to the basics here. You know, what is causing climate change? We know, right, that it's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's F-gases, nitrous oxides, methane, but the vast majority of it, more than 3/4, is carbon dioxide, which is why decarbonisation is so critical. Now, when you look at that carbon, more than 80% of that comes directly or indirectly from energy. So that's why we understand what the problem is. We understand that energy is the biggest part of it. So what can we do about it? We need to simplify it. We need to understand where's that coming from. Well, not surprisingly, it's coming from fossil fuels. But interestingly, the demand for that is coming from just 3 sectors. Almost all of that demand is in either buildings or industry or in transport. So we know what we need to do. We know where we need to do it. So we need to find out what can we do in those areas. This is how we get the fastest results for it. So firstly, I would say the technology already exists. There's always new things coming out, and it's great, but we can't kick the can down the road. We know that we need to take action now. Everything we need to do, we can do with technology that is already existing and is emerging now. So I want to go back to that curve I showed at the beginning. Remember where we said carbon emissions are the highest that they've been for 2 million years on Earth now. And look at some of the causes of that. So if you've heard me talk about electricity 4.0 before, this is just the quick summary of it. That if we go back to about 1750, first industrial revolution, so everyone's heard of industrial revolutions, right? But every time there's been an industrial revolution, there's been a simultaneous electrical revolution. So think back to the first industrial revolution was about mechanization and steam power. At the same time, Volta and Faraday were looking at the practical uses of electricity. How can we use this? Now, these went in cycles of roughly every 100 years, and it goes from invention and creation to scale, to invention and creation to scale. So all those technologies that came from the first industrial revolution, by the second one, it was about scaling those. So the second industrial revolution was about mass production, mass creation of things. And in order to fuel that, we needed far more energy. So this is the point of electricity 2.0, where we started to scale the availability of electricity. So here we see the first power stations starting to come out. And guess what was fueling those power stations? It was coal. So look at that point where we really started to scale up because of the second industrial revolution, our demand for energy. And look what happens. It's when human-induced CO2 really starts to rise. Now, if you look at the third revolution, arguably around about 1950, it was again the introduction of a new technology. So here it was silicon. So silicon enabled the third industrial revolution of automation. But it also brought about changes for energy and for electricity. So the very first solar cells, remember calculators years ago with the little tiny solar cells on the top of them. The birth of silicon was really the birth of our renewable technologies as well, but also digital, our ability to control things digitally, which gives us lots of power to use things better, more control, more usability. And that brings us right up to today, where we take that third one and we scale it. So the fourth industrial revolution is the massive scale of industrial Internet of Things and automation. And the fourth electrical revolution is electric and digital at scale. And when you put that curve now into perspective of what needs to happen between now and 2050, you see how fast that curve needs to drop off. And electricity 4.0 is, we are confident, the thing that will drive that change and get us back on track for where we need to be. So there's the first good news. The technology exists for us to be able to do this. Second good news, more governments are making commitments. So the last time I checked, I think there were more than 90 countries that had made net zero pledges. That's about 90%, more than 90% of global CO2 emissions, and huge amounts of money being poured into green investments. So we have the technology, we have commitments from governments. What about companies? Companies are making more and more commitments as well. This I love. It's a bit like Moore's Law, where you see a doubling year on year on year. We see this with sustainability commitments to science-based targets. So if you look back, in 2018, there were about 200 companies signed up for science-based targets. It has doubled year on year, to a point where mid-year this year it was around about 5,500. And don't think of that as just 5,500 companies. These are 5,500 leaders who can inspire others, but who take others on the journey as well. So when you sign up for science-based targets, you're not just looking at your scope 1 and your scope 2, you're looking at your scope 3. So that means pulling in your entire supply chain. So whereas if we'd looked at this 4 or 5 years ago, almost all would be large companies and almost all would have been based in Europe. Now you see that science-based targets create this whole global ecosystem of global companies pulling in all of their supply chain. So you see now it's roughly half of it is large and half of it is small and medium, half of it's Europe and half is the rest of the world. So it's brilliant. It's bringing more and more people, which is creating this domino effect and this acceleration. So all these are great things. We know what we need to do. We know where we need to do these things. We know the technology exists. We know that all the governments and companies are putting their commitments in place. But the reality is not quite as appealing. So last year it was 8%. So we're seeing progress. This year, 12% of Fortune 500s actually delivering on the commitments that they're making. So commitments are one thing, but they're meaningless unless they're followed through with action. So we need to see far more action. And to do that, we wanted to understand what are the problems, what are the challenges, why are so many people failing to deliver on their targets. And we spoke to more than 500 C-suite executives from all different parts of the world, from companies with a turnover of more than $1 billion. And we asked them, what are the biggest challenges you see when you are trying to decarbonize? And the 4 things you see there at the top, I'll take those. Stakeholder alignment. Where do we start? Who do we need on this journey with us? How do we get everybody on the same page? And really, it's board level down, identifying who do you need to be working with. The data collection, the reporting, the transparency, where do you begin to understand not just your energy, but your carbon emissions? And if you want to go further into scope 3, how on earth do you then try and understand that across all of your supply chain and what their carbon emissions are? What about budget and financing? So this is often a stumbling block where people think that it's expensive. The thing I love about investing in green tech is it's quite unique that you're not investing in a cost, you're investing in a saving. And we all need to do this at some point. So why would we not do it now? The sooner you do it as a corporation, the sooner you start to reap those rewards. And once it's paid for itself, the return on investment, by the way, is very quick. To do light touches, it's less than a year. To do something substantial, it's 3 years, and to do everything, it's probably 8 to 10 years. But the return on investment is very quick for the fast rewards that you want to get. And then once you've got that, it's recurring. It's saving after saving after saving. So the sooner you do it, the sooner you have competitive advantage versus those around you. So think of it as an investment in a saving rather than a cost to move to this. And then there was technology and workforce skills as well. So are lots of companies committing to make change and then failing to deliver on it because they don't know how to do it? And a lot of that is because they need to work with partners. No one knows how to do this stuff. And particularly if you're thinking about scope 3, a large company might have a chief sustainability officer and a whole team. But if they want to decarbonize their supply chain, what about the small companies? They won't have CSOs. They won't have necessarily sustainability teams. So it's about working with partners that can provide that guidance all the way from end to end. And it's basically a lack of understanding of CO2 science and how to put together a roadmap. And why the roadmap? Well, we asked the same audience, what are you actually pursuing today? What are you prioritizing? Now remember, I'll come back to those 3 levers. We can completely decarbonize energy by replacing with renewables, by electrifying things, and by reducing the way we use energy. And I said everybody automatically thinks of energy, they think of wind turbines and solar panels, which is very important. But not enough people think about the rest of it. So when we asked, about half of them, just over half, were talking about wanting to purchase renewables. PPAs. PPAs, by the way, make great financial sense because you can bulk buy energy with others and you get clean energy at a lower rate, which frees up money for you to then invest in other decarbonization initiatives. So 56%, great. Worryingly, that's almost half of companies we spoke to aren't even thinking about sourcing clean energy. When we move to the next pillar, which is the reduce, so be more efficient, we're into the 40s. Only 44% of companies looking to use energy more efficiently. And when we come to the last point, which was the electrify, remember this is a third of the solution, because supply chases demand. We're creating demand for fossil fuel. Only around a third of people were looking at ways to transition to more electrification. So what should we be doing? Well, we should be, based on what we've done with now starting to work with more and more Fortune 500s, in fact 50% of them now we're starting to work with, that leading companies use a very simple integrated approach. That is to strategize, it's to digitize, and it is to decarbonize. So what do I mean by that? And I told you it was simple. Strategize is measure, create, structure, engage, communicate. In simplest terms, that is, where are we today? Where do we want to be tomorrow? How are we going to get there? Who do we need on that journey with us? And then we can communicate this because we have something tangible that we know we can achieve. And all of these go together. It's not one after the other. Because in order to be able to do that and create your roadmap and structure how you're going to do it, you need to digitize. Digitize means putting in place the tools that will enable you to understand your resource usage and track your emissions so that you can identify where you can make savings and you can benchmark and show the progress that you're making more effectively. And the last part is decarbonize. So I won't ask who was listening, but guess what? Replace, electrify, reduce. This is how we decarbonize energy. And the way we decarbonize it is building those steps into that plan to strategize, digitize, and then do the decarbonization steps. So I think I'm about at time now. So just to wrap up, I'm going to say next steps. There is directly opposite here, after this, after we're finished now, there is a workshop with a colleague of mine, Fabien, who's our vice president of our sustainability business. Unmissable. I think it's registration only, but if you've registered, it's starting in about 5 minutes. Go along, because it takes this theory that I've just given you of what we need to do and turns that into how do you make that into a strategy and action. Think of it like a free consultation of what you can be doing. So that's kicking off in about 5 minutes. I fully recommend it. Is Fabien in the room, actually? Is it? There he is, Fabien. So shortly after this, Fabien will be leading that one. And that's it. I'll stop there and pause and just say, please, if you're interested in anything that I've had to say, or you want to find out more, or you disagree with any of the things that I've said, I love having discussions about this stuff. So please connect with me on LinkedIn, or I'll be around for the rest of the day today. So come and grab me, or go to the Schneider booth and let them know that you're looking for me, and I'll come and find you and say hi. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Scott.